Supermarket Horror Stories. The first story, Malevolence Isles, the Supermarket Horror. I always considered myself lucky, living in a small, quiet town where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. But that all changed one fateful day when I decided to visit the local supermarket, a place I had been countless times before. Little did I know that this routine trip would become a harrowing experience that would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in our little town. The sun was shining, and the sky was a brilliant blue. The supermarket, with its faded yellow sign and flickering neon lights, seemed inviting in its familiarity. I parked my car in the nearly empty lot and strolled inside. As I entered, the smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, but something felt off. The usual hustle and bustle of shoppers was absent, replaced by an eerie silence. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed ominously, casting long, stark shadows on the linoleum floor. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and grabbed a shopping cart, the wheels squeaking in protest. The supermarket was unnaturally quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the refrigeration units. I made my way to the produce section, where I was greeted by a display of wilting vegetables and rotting fruit. Picking up a lifeless tomato, I noticed that its skin was pale and translucent. This wasn't the fresh, vibrant produce I was used to. I placed it back and hurried away, the sensation of dread gnawing at the pit of my stomach. My next stop was the dairy aisle, but what I found there was even more unsettling. The shelves were lined with rows of milk cartons, each one bearing a date that made my blood run cold. The expiration dates on the milk were all marked for the same day, today. How was that possible? It couldn't be a mere coincidence that I decided to head to the checkout, thinking that I could pay for the few items I had picked up and leave this strange place behind. But as I made my way to the front of the store, I noticed a figure standing by the cash registers. It was a man in a tattered and soiled store uniform, his back to me. He appeared to be scanning items, but there was something off about his movements. His jerky, mechanical motions sent a shiver down my spine. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. "Excuse me," I stammered, "I'd like to check out." The man didn't respond. He just continued scanning items, seemingly unaware of my presence. I cleared my throat and reached out to tap him on the shoulder, but when my fingers made contact, he turned slowly to face me. The sight that met my eyes sent me reeling. The man's face was ashen, his eyes completely white, devoid of any pupils or irises. His lips were drawn back in a grotesque smile that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. I stumbled back, my shopping cart clattering to the ground, and the man's unnerving grin widened even further. I turned and fled, not daring to look back, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rushed down the empty aisles, I noticed more and more strange occurrences. Shelves were stocked with expired and spoiled goods, their labels bearing eerie messages. Cans of soup read, "Beware," and boxes of cereal said, "The end is near." It was as if the very products themselves were trying to convey a message. Desperate to escape this nightmare, I made my way to the store's exit, but as I approached, I was confronted with an even more horrifying sight. The automatic sliding doors that had always been a gateway to freedom were now sealed shut. I pushed and tugged, but they remained unyielding, as if they were guarding a dark secret. Panicking, I turned to look for another way out. That's when I noticed a group of shoppers gathered near the bakery section, their expressions blank and vacant, their carts filled with the same expired and spoiled goods that I had encountered earlier. They moved in a slow, synchronized manner, as if they were part of some macabre dance. I watched in horror as they placed their items on a display table, forming a grotesque still life of rot and decay. Feeling trapped and outnumbered, I decided to hide in the store's dimly lit stockroom, hoping to evade whatever sinister force had taken over the supermarket. I huddled in the corner, my heart racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Time seemed to blur as I sat there, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I couldn't make sense of the nightmare I had stumbled into. Hours must have passed, but it felt like an eternity. I contemplated the possibility that I had gone mad or that I had somehow crossed into an alternate reality. Finally, a faint whisper of voices reached my ears. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices were low and unintelligible, but they seemed to be getting closer. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound, and watched as the stockroom door slowly creaked open that a shadowy figure emerged, moving silently into the room. I could only make out the silhouette, but I knew it was not like the others. It was different, and that difference filled me with a glimmer of hope. The figure stepped closer, and as it came into the dim light, I saw that it was a young woman. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her appearance was disheveled, as if she had been through a harrowing ordeal. She reached out a hand to me, her voice trembling. "You have to come with me," she whispered urgently. "They're coming, and we need to escape." I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I could trust her, but the dread that had filled the supermarket left me with no other option. I grabbed her hand, and together we slipped out of the stockroom and into the store. The supermarket had transformed into a nightmare landscape. The shoppers who had once moved in eerie unison were now converging on the bakery section, their blank faces contorted with an insatiable hunger. The shelves were now stocked with grotesque and otherworldly produce, and the man with the inhuman smile was directing the others in a sinister ritual. The young woman and I moved silently through the aisles, doing our best to avoid the attention of the deranged shoppers. We had no idea what had caused this terrifying transformation, but it was clear that the supermarket had become a trap, a place where the ordinary had given way to the malevolent. As we made our way toward the front of the store, we encountered the sealed sliding doors once again, but this time, they were no longer an impenetrable barrier. The young woman pushed on them with all her might, and they slowly began to give way. We slipped outside, gasping for breath as the cool, fresh air hit our faces. We found ourselves in the nearly empty parking lot, the setting sun casting long shadows. But our relief was short-lived, for as we turned to look back at the supermarket, we saw that it had become an otherworldly, nightmarish realm. The building itself had twisted and contorted, its walls pulsating with an eerie, unnatural energy. The flickering neon lights had taken on a sickly green hue, and the entire structure seemed to be alive with malevolence. We knew we had to put as much distance between us and that abomination as possible. Without a word, we got into my car and sped away from the supermarket, leaving the nightmare behind. As we drove through the darkening town, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused the once peaceful place to become a locus of horror. We never returned to that town, and I've tried to put the memory of that day behind me. But the supermarket, with its eerie transformation and the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls, still haunts my dreams. I'll never forget the man with the inhuman smile, the whispered warnings on the shelves, or the grotesque dance of the shoppers. To this day, I wonder if the supermarket was a portal to another dimension, a place where the ordinary turned malevolent, or if it was a warning, a glimpse into a terrifying future. Whatever the truth may be, I know one thing for certain: I'll never look at a grocery store the same way again, and I'll forever be wary of the darkness that can lurk beneath the most mundane of places. The second story, Frozen in Fear, the Supermarket of Shadows. The supermarket was never a place I'd consider frightening. It was the epitome of everyday life. But one evening, as I ventured through those familiar aisles, I discovered that even the most mundane locations could house unspeakable horrors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I strolled through the store, my shopping cart squeaking intermittently. It was a typical trip to pick up groceries, the kind of task that usually bored me to tears. But this time, something felt off. As I reached for a box of cereal, I sensed an eerie presence lurking in the shadows. It was a prickling sensation at the nape of my neck, the feeling that unseen eyes watched my every move. I turned, half expecting to find someone behind me, but the aisle was empty. Shelves neatly stocked with products and the store's usual hum were all that met my gaze. I shook off the unease, attributing it to my overactive imagination. The day had been long, and perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. I continued my shopping, placing items in my cart as I moved down the aisles. Yet, the feeling persisted, like a splinter in the back of my mind. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights grew louder, casting eerie, elongated shadows across the floor. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the checkout and escape this strange disquiet. The sense of being watched clung to me, a feeling that someone or something was tracking my every step that I arrived at the checkout area, but it was devoid of life. Empty lanes stretched before me, and the cashier counters were abandoned. Shopping carts, haphazardly discarded, were strewn about, their contents spilling onto the floor. The store was eerily silent, and the usual bustling atmosphere had vanished. "Hello." I called out, the desperation in my voice echoing through the empty space. Silence was the only response. I began to panic, convinced that something was terribly wrong. It was as if I had stepped into an alternate reality, one where the living had disappeared, and I was the sole survivor in a ghost town. My heart pounded as I approached the automatic sliding doors leading to the outside world. I needed to escape this uncanny place, to breathe fresh air and regain my bearings. But the doors remained obstinately closed, despite my repeated attempts to push them open. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was trapped. The invisible eyes I had sensed in the aisles were now an oppressive presence, suffocating me with their malevolence. The very walls of the supermarket seemed to close in around me. Turning away from the unyielding doors, I searched for an alternative exit. I stumbled upon a small, unassuming door in a dimly lit corner, its exit sign flickering ominously. Without a second thought, I pushed it open, hoping it would lead me to freedom. The door revealed a dim, narrow corridor, a flickering light bulb overhead casting eerie shadows. The air was damp and reeked of decay. An unsettling feeling gnawed at my insides, telling me that I had entered a place where I should not be. As I ventured further into the corridor, the putrid odor grew stronger, mixing with a strange, metallic tang. The narrow passageway seemed to extend indefinitely, a disorienting maze from which there was no escape. The flickering light did nothing to ease my discomfort, it only intensified the eeriness of the environment. Turning a corner, I came across a room, its door partially ajar. The dim light within spilled into the hallway, revealing a scene from a nightmare. The room was a grotesque parody of a supermarket aisle, except that instead of groceries, it was lined with rows of human bodies. They hung from hooks like cuts of meat in a slaughterhouse, their eyes frozen in expressions of terror. Some were missing limbs, and others had been brutally mutilated. The room was a horrifying mosaic of red and brown, and the walls were adorned with sickening smears. The room itself exuded malevolence, as if it were a portal to the darkest recesses of the human psyche. That I staggered back in horror, but a soft, sinister whisper filled the air. The voice seemed to emanate from all around me, a haunting presence that said, "You shouldn't have come here." Its words sent a chill down my spine, and I knew I had to leave. I fled down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The flickering light above and the relentless buzzing of the fluorescent bulbs added to the nightmarish atmosphere. The invisible eyes were no longer content to watch, they pursued me, a malevolent force closing in. Turning another corner, I found a door that seemed to beckon. With a rush of hope, I pushed it open, only to find myself back in the main supermarket. But it was no longer the place I had entered earlier. The shelves were no longer lined with products, instead, they held grotesque, monstrous creatures. Their eyes fixated on me with hunger and malice, their movements jerky and unnatural. I was trapped in a nightmare, and the grotesque beings closed in, their ghastly forms reaching for me. The door I had come through had vanished, leaving me no escape. As the creatures descended upon me, their twisted features and gaping maws filled my vision, and I let out a final, blood-curdling scream. In an instant, the supermarket claimed me, and I became one of its grotesque inhabitants, a prisoner in a never-ending nightmare. As I lingered in the aisles of the supernatural supermarket, my only hope was that my story would serve as a warning: never enter the supermarket after dark, for it is a place where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and the horrors that lurk in the shadows can consume you whole.